We've thought about some very big questions yesterday. So James and Google Cultural Institute sort of setting some keywords for us around agility and around change and transformation, getting us to think about where we are with digital heritage and what are the influences on change and what sort of shape organisations are we becoming and should we become, and where does digital fit within that structure. Today we've been thinking about the impact of our research. We've been thinking about how to cultivate and foster innovation within our organisations. What we want to do this afternoon is to spin the question around a little bit, or the subject around a little bit, and look at it from another angle. Of course, you're managing your collections in universities. You are undertaking, as we've heard in the last session, some quite brilliant projects. But the other thing that we're doing is that we're teaching. And unlike many of our other museum colleagues in the sector, in the university museum sector, we're part of a learning organisation. We're part of a teaching organisation. So it seems appropriate for us to think about and to welcome and include in the session those students of ours who are also reflecting upon digital dimensions and reflecting upon digital humanities and digital heritage. As the introduction just said, we know, and certainly the references in the last session, some of the freshest, most exciting, and to use a word that's been used in the context of the World Cup in the last week, some of the most fearless researchers come in the shape of our PhD candidates. So we thought it would be a very good use of our time and a really lovely end to the day to hear from three PhD students who are wrestling with exactly the sorts of issues around agility and digital humanities and digital production. We're going to hear from three different people who are at three different points in their career and are coming from three very different backgrounds. And as they introduce themselves, I think it'd be sort of useful to keep that in mind, because I'm very keen to sort of draw out some conclusions at the end about who does digital heritage research, as well as what sort of questions they're asking. If you could just indulge me for just 5 or 10 minutes before we sort of spend 20 minutes in the company of Elena, Peter and Amy, I wanted to just sort of set a few questions up, if I may. I've been at Leicester for 16 years now. I'm the academic director now in the College of Arts, Humanities and Law, which is very interesting for me because it now allows me to see doctoral candidates and teaching provision and have working relationships with colleagues across the humanities and not just in my area of museum studies. And it allows me to think about the nature of my subject, so museum studies and digital heritage, and how it might be different to some of those other parts of the academy, because I think it is. I want to just highlight 3 words that I think I'd like to suggest that they might be useful tags to put on digital heritage as an area of research. I think there's something that we can say about how digital heritage is beginning to localize its research questions, that actually where you are in the world matters quite significantly, more than perhaps we first thought when it comes to asking these questions of digital. And I want to say a little bit about that. I want to say a little bit about, well, Richard Clay earlier on was talking about the CATH collaboration between the University of Leicester and the University of Birmingham, where we've funded 19 triplets of building digital prototypes. And I think there's something going on in there, and through some other projects that we've been leading, that tell us about the collaboration and the collective nature of digital heritage research, that it always seems to involve many people and many partners. And actually some of the things that the AHRC in particular are doing to really help broker and find connections within that community. Where I'd like to start, though, is on a question of post-disciplinarity. There's some things I want to say about the divisions between academic disciplines, who the experts are and where the content goes. The academy, this place we inhabit professionally is for a couple of thousand years or more, has had these very clear, defined, distinct areas of inquiry and investigation. Going back to the trivium, the quadrivium, we can see in those divisions of the liberal arts, we can see very clearly those distinctions between grammar and logic and rhetoric, and then music and arithmetic and geometry and astronomy and so on, and right back from classical antiquity through the medieval period with divinity and physics and natural philosophy and in the Renaissance, and through to the emergence of the big science subjects in the 18th and 19th century, and through to the many of the social sciences that start to emerge and subdivisions within the sciences and the history schools that we saw in the 20th century. We see very clearly defined tribes, communities of scholarship that are differentiated by the types of research questions they ask, typically the types of methodologies they use, the types of data and evidence that they seek to assemble, and their behaviour, how they publish, the conventions and protocols of how they communicate with each other, whether they have learned societies or particularly well-defined communities of practice. All those things continue to reinforce an academic domain that preserves those discrete subject areas. And we could say that maybe even our school curriculum enforces that from an early age. And yet, a subject like museum studies, it was in the mid-1960s that in Manchester and in Leicester and in Washington, D.C., simultaneously, professionals started to think about formalizing a curriculum that could help curators to reflect upon their practice and to accredit that curriculum. It came at a different moment. Museum studies is still a very young subject. It's academically young compared to other subjects. And it's quite useful, perhaps, to see it as a post-discipline. I don't see museum studies as a discipline. I think it's a subject area. So I'm one of 12 academics in Leicester, and we all come from different academic disciplines. I'm trained as a historian. I have colleagues who are educationalists, anthropologists, archaeologists, paleobiologists, marketeers, electrical engineers, art historians, and so on. There's 12 different academic disciplines are required, we think, and there's probably more, to teach museum studies. None of us could teach museum studies on their own. We all rely on each other. So it's like tent poles leaning in. And between us, we get to make the curriculum. It makes for a fantastic academic environment because it means we rely on each other. We have to team teach. We have to constantly collaborate and keep each other informed on what we're doing with our teaching provision. And I don't think that necessarily happens in all academic departments. I think that's too controversial to say that. I think it means that the subject is then populated by people who are passing through or come from a variety of different subject backgrounds. And as a subject, it's a very welcoming subject. It's a subject that sees that there's a common project at the heart of it. We want to make museums and galleries better. We want them to be the best they can be. We want to innovate and to improve and develop all those different aspects of collecting and documentation and research and conservation and display and education provision and inclusion and so on. So I think it becomes a very supportive and respectful subject, which I think is a reason why many of us like to study and work in this area. But what we've seen, certainly in Leicester in the last 40 years, we're coming up to our 50th birthday actually in 2016, which is quite fantastic. Once upon a time we were just one subject, museum studies, that was taught through PhD and part-time courses, but in the last few years there's been a diversification both in the modes of delivery. We teach flexibly now, distance learning to 200 postgraduates around the world, but we've also offered short courses, spring schools, master classes, even bite-sized courses in a bag that you could buy for £80 and study for a month with us. At the same time as that mode of delivery is diversified, so's the subject areas. So you don't just come to UCL or to Manchester or to Nottingham or to UEA or to St Andrews and all those brilliant courses across the country. You don't just study something called museum studies anymore. You know, there's a good chance you're doing arts management or art museum and gallery studies or visitor studies or interpretation and heritage. Digital heritage is one of those new subjects that's emerged for us just in the last 5 years. And we think it's got many of those qualities that museum studies has. It's welcoming, it's supportive, it's just cross-disciplinary by design. It's instinctively, reflexively, habitually collaborative. So it has all of those qualities, but we think there's something else going on in digital heritage research, that area of research that we've been talking about today. It's quite a fluid subject. If you look around the world at people who teach and research digital heritage, they'll use lots of different words. If you go to Quebec, it'll be la cybermuséologie, which is rather cool. Or there's a lot of courses. So, for instance, Harvard and Johns Hopkins University will just talk about new curatorship now, and they're kind of dropping the D word and just saying that it's just inherent in what we do. But we think that digital heritage has that wonderful sort of sense across disciplinarity, and it's very relaxed about where subject boundaries are. And you have permission to cross into different subject areas. And I think you'll hear about that in a moment from these three presentations. A couple of other things about digital heritage research. I think it has a very open mind about who the expert is. When you're constantly in the room and with lots of other people from lots of different subject areas, it can be quite levelling, actually. It's very typical in the projects I've been part of and the initiatives I've been part of that there's a great sense of mutual respect. It's quite a democratic environment because everybody's needed. The coders needed, the design experts needed, the educational designers needed, the marketing expert, the person who's the subject expert, the person who's the historian of media. We all have a part to play in these projects. But so do those individuals outside of academia. Digital heritage always involves relationships between academics and museum practitioners. And typically, because of the technology, you'll find commercial partners and technology providers involved as well. One of the projects that we've been part of in the last 3 years, which was a science and heritage funded project from EPSRC and AHRC, was called Representing Reformation. Representing Reformation, I think, absolutely epitomises this sense of digital heritage research, which is so open. We had space scientists, so physicists, helping art historians to crack a 16th century art history mystery. So a Norfolk family, the Dukes of Norfolk, the Howard family at the time of the Reformation, went from being an incredibly powerful family to a family that lost everything. And we have a tomb, or English Heritage have a tomb at Thetford, at the Priory site there, that was only partially built and was finished 10 years later by a different mason in a different stone in a different religious and political context where the iconography was different and even the meaning of having a funeral monument was different. Those space scientists are using the technology they use to scan moon rock and comets and things, not comets, meteorites. Comets are snowballs that don't come down to Earth, meteorites. And they use that technology and some of the pattern matching and fantastic three-dimensional work to help us scan 200 fragments of a tomb that was never finished to allow us to assemble what this tomb was intended to be like and 3D printed and put together a fabulous, fabulous exhibition. So thank you, AHRC. It was the best project I've ever been part of. But our audiences were part of that project as well. We had an audience advocate, Adair Richards there at the bottom, and the local communities, local schools were part of that project. And we had campaigns through the project. We were crowdsourcing as part of our research. We were asking local people to help us do some of the archival research and to respect the expertise that they have in that area. And I think, to me, that just encapsulated some values that I think sit at the heart of digital heritage research as well. It's open, it's inclusive, it's respectful, and it's incredibly exciting because of that. I think we give away a lot of our content as well because we're relying on working collectively and collaboratively, HEIs, non-HEIs, the public, the commercial sector. We're used to seeing our data and our evidence being shared and being made transparent. And I think the open source sort of movement has therefore been very conspicuous within digital heritage research. I talked about, I'm just going to talk for about another 5 minutes and we'll pass on then, but I talked about brokerage as well. We have seen a really exciting shift. I don't need to tell you because you've been part of it, and actually many of you in the room have kind of led this initiative in the last 5 years. We've seen an exciting change from the research councils and from Leicester and Arts Council, but also from universities and themselves to change round the usual sequence in which research happens in the humanities. Rather than that academic having her idea, her research question that fits into her research interests and her research priorities, conceiving a project, then going to find a museum who would be a suitable case study or a partner or to use that particular collection. What we've seen in recent years are genuine moments where that ideation moment has been shared. The images here are from a project we ran called Live Museum, where we, again, AHRC funded, thanks Gail, we ran a series of sand pits. It was 2 years ago, everything was a sand pit 2 years ago. We ran a series of sand pits where for 2 days we got a group of people, designers, curators, students, lecturers, company directors involved. There's Graham Howard, I'm sure some of you know from SSL there, having just made his plasticine and pipe cleaner model and being very proud of it. And we immerse people in a very kind of supportive, creative workshop environment. And our objective was that we had 48 hours to come up with a credible research project. By the end of Live Museum, we wanted to generate 5 project ideas and broker teams around them. And in every case, we wanted those projects to be strategically intelligent, which meant they weren't esoteric, abstract pieces of work. These were projects where there was a genuine need. So it wouldn't be that there was an impact case or a pathway to impact that would have to be grafted on and retrofitted. These projects, by design, at that ideation moment, were genuinely and substantively addressing a need and all about impact. A couple of the projects that came from that, one was ISAE, my colleague Yesemi Vavala has led again, having secured AHRC Research Network funding. Another project, Transforming Thresholds, was about those of us working over a year and a half to look at the media that could be in place within museum foyers and allow different ways of thinking in museum foyers. We looked at retail ideas, ideas from gaming, and we looked at ideas from theatre and performance and how changing the conceptual framework of what a threshold was to a museum, it could add value. In all of those cases, brokerage was important. The museum's computer group was a vital network for us. Down here in the bottom right-hand corner, somebody from BT. BT were an important partner in that particular project. Finally, you'll be pleased to hear, I think there's something about localization in digital heritage. So we have this subject that's open, multidisciplinary, almost celebrating and enjoying the puckish way that it kind of jumps over disciplinary boundaries. It's trying to be strategically intelligent. It relishes brokerage. It likes to find projects that involve partnership, and it wants to generate project ideas where everybody's in the room from the beginning. I think there's another characteristic of digital heritage research, which we may hear in these projects in the next hour, which is about localization. Maybe when we were writing about museums and technology, even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago, there was a tendency to write in quite a generalizing, universal way. We would talk about the web, the impact that the web is having on museums, the impact that that mobile technology is having on art galleries. What we've seen in recent years is a very useful refinement of that now is starting to recognize that place matters, that where you are in the world, what museum sector you're in, what cultural context you're in, what jurisdiction you're in, what culture of media literacy and IT literacy and connectivity that you might be in, all has an impact upon how that community might be addressing some of the questions we had today. Put it another way, I think these have been particularly British questions we've asked today. If we were in the US, I think we would see some subtly different questions. If we were in Denmark, which is where I'm examining a PhD in a couple of weeks' time, I know we would see a very different set of conclusions about, say, the potential of new media. I've been doing a lot of work in Japan recently and Hong Kong. Again, those two countries are framing different types of questions. The priorities are not the same priorities as here in the UK. So we're learning to differentiate. We're learning to see that digital heritage is also culturally contingent, and that can only be a good thing. Okay, so those just a few things to sort of frame some possible themes for the rest of this session. I'm going to step away now. I'm going to ask, over the next hour, we're looking to probably have sort of 15, 20 minutes around each discussion. We'll be hearing from Elena Villaespesa and her work on developing methodologies for measuring the value and impact of our social media within a museum context. Peter Pavement, some of you may know, you'll know Elena, I'm sure, as web analyst at Tate, and some of you will know Peter from his director role in surface impression with a number of clients across the country. Peter's work looks at convergent media and the ways in which our workflows and means of production are changing in the museum sector. But before we turn to those two, I'm going to ask Amy Hetherington, whose PhD is being partly funded by the Collections Trust, another collaboration, another PhD that was responding to a specific need. And Amy's work, I'm sure she'll tell you all about in a moment, is looking at the recent history of design around digital media for children. But to allow her to get from her chair to here, and to also reinforce the fact that this is going to be a very supportive session, we should show our appreciation to Amy.
Well, since Ross announced an hour and a half ago that he'd like me to actually start off with introducing myself properly, nothing like last-minute presentation additions. As he said, my name's Amy Hetherington. I'm Canadian by birth, which we have quite an interesting international conglomerate here, I think. So I'm coming very much from that perspective, but I did do my MA at the University of Leicester in the Museum Studies department. So I've been over here for quite a few years before I started my PhD, and I'm actually 6 months away now from submission. So I'm a final year writing up student now, which has its own amounts of stress. But my background is originally actually in classical archaeology and linguistics as well, and that's what I did up until the time that I got into museum studies here at Leicester. So part of my background is very much an historical outlook, very similar to Ross, so that's kind of very informed quite a bit of the projects I do and quite a bit of the research that I do. So there's a starting point. Getting on to the rest of the presentation. I'm going to read, because if I don't, I'm going to get completely off topic and we'll be here for the next 45 minutes. When Ross first emailed me a few weeks ago to ask if I'd be willing to participate in this panel, he pitched an idea about how he hoped our discussion this afternoon might go, which is the idea surrounding post-digital. And I got to thinking about this as a very ephemeral term. It's hard to pinpoint what it is. It's not something that's cropped up in my reading over the last 3 years, or even something I've really encountered in the museums that I've been working with. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just something I think we're not quite talking about yet. And Ross suggested, I think, specifically about post-digital design, which is surrounding my project. Post is one of those interesting words in the English language that has a whole host of meanings. I'm going to ignore the one about post and beam and the archaeological joke about post holes, because I'm not sure you guys would quite get that. But post often means after. We say post 2010, after 2010. But post-digital has a slightly different meaning, I think. We don't really mean after digital. Digital is still here. It's still part of what we do. It's how we look at digital, I think, that's changed. So post-digital to me actually means a world where digital is taken for granted. We've taken a step forward from that. It's everywhere, it's in everything we do, and it's almost invisible, in fact. We don't even give thought to whipping out our iPhones and taking a photograph of a slide that's up in a presentation because we really like the quote. This fits in really nicely with my thesis. One of the authors I've come across in the last 3 years was Don Tapscott, who says about children that technology is like air to them. They don't even think in terms of this is technology and that isn't technology. Children, I think, are already living very much in a post-digital world. And that takes me back to the second definition of post, which is after, and which I use in the title of my thesis, which is Designing for the Post-Millennials. In this case, I mean after millennials, children who've been born since the last generation, since the beginning of the 21st century. So really children that are 14 years and under. They've grown up, at least in this country, though certainly not in every country in the world, surrounded by technology. It's part of their lives. But how are museums functioning, therefore, in this post-digital world? How are they reacting to it? And what has changed over the last few decades? I'm a museum professional by job for the last few years, but I found myself less concerned actually with what visitors think and feel, and more concerned with why museum staff make certain choices. I've started to ask the questions, what influences museum staff in their designs, and what assumptions do they make about their visitors? So what do I mean when I talk about digital interactives during this presentation? I needed to have a focus for my research and narrow down my research project. So I decided to look specifically at in-gallery interactives, those that are placed or used within the gallery space, so not websites or mobile, which Elena is going to go into in depth in her presentation later. These here are examples of fairly typical late 1990s, early 2000s design of the desktop computer screen, either with quiz or info kiosks or some sort of game that's available for the visitor. And they can either be kiosk stations somewhere in the museum or wall stations, or even in the early stages, touch screens. However, all of these examples here were created within the last 8 years, rather than late 1990s. Something to think about as we go on. So the real question, I think, is if we're going to understand and talk about the post-digital world, or in this case, post-digital design specifically, we really have to understand what came before. We don't talk a lot about the history of institutions, especially these days. We rarely throw ourselves back 10 or 20 years to review what's already happened, feeling perhaps that it's already been covered, but has it? To understand museum gallery design today, we really do need to look backwards and talk about what worked and what didn't, and where the influences come from. In my research, I turned to digital literacy theory. It has its own challenges, as any recent field of study does, but it presents several interesting ideas about digital and children and about adult assumptions. These are 2 photographs from the National Space Center where I've been doing some of my field research. And this is their new gallery that opened last year in July 2013, so it's nearly a year old now. It's a redevelopment of the original 2001 gallery from when the center first opened. The original gallery was entirely static. It was almost entirely text panels with a few images thrown in. This new gallery, as you can see, is anything but static. It's entirely interactives. Some of them are digital, some of them are more physical, but they're all interactive. And it caters very much for a new type of idea of fun, if you're learning through fun. So not necessarily having an educational drive to it, but knowing that if the visitor is enjoying what they're doing, they're probably learning something out of it. However, everything that was put into this gallery was also designed so that the educational department could use it in their school group visits. Museums really came into the digital interactive craze in the 1990s, but very small museums these days are still struggling to find the resources and the staff to even contemplate putting such a thing in their exhibitions. Because of that, my focus for my research was very on more regional and slightly larger institutions. Digital literacy theory comes from both computer science and from media studies, but today it can be seen as a dichotomy between academic and public discourse. They're basically 2 sides of the same coin, with differing views of what digital literacy is and also how digitally literate children actually are. For museums, institutions in the public realm, it's hard to ignore the public discourses that stream through media, through education, and perhaps more particularly from the visitor themselves. However, digital literacy, whichever definition or understanding that you use, exists in a post-digital world. It's a theory based on understanding children's digital levels and abilities, while assuming that basically access to technology is not the great concern because it's already so prevalent. Digital literacy theory has evolved substantially academically in the last 15 years, and to a much lesser extent publicly. But have museums reacted to this? Are staff still keeping to the old ideas about technology and children? These examples come from about the mid-2000s, roughly 10 years ago. They're more complex than the first slide of interactives that I showed, and they're both touch screens. One on the left is from the National Space Center, and on the right is a computer station with a touchscreen monitor linked to a larger display monitor on the wall, which is at Weston Park Museum in Sheffield. Both of them allow multiple visitors to participate in the interactives at once. In order to understand staff views, I approached my research from a qualitative perspective. I stuck to the tried and tested method of in-depth interviews, using digital literacy theory to inform my questions. However, there's an issue with relying on this one form, specifically when research deals with such a breadth of history. Staff turnover in museums is rampant, especially since 2008. It was an issue for all the institutions I spoke with, though one of the factors in choosing the institutions that I researched with came down to the fact that there were at least a few staff who had been there for several years. But this still left gaps. Inevitably, a key staff member had since moved on. Searching for how to fill this gap, I returned to my historical roots and the use of documentation. This isn't a common practice in museum studies, and it's unusual, especially in my department. But documents can fill those gaps, as well as create new ones. Design briefs, project pitches, tender documents, illustrations, and photographs can be useful information to offset and accompany interview data, though there's always the understanding that documents can be just as biased as interviews. In the top left is a digital interactive that requires children to search the poster above for information that they then answer questions on the screen. On the top right is a transportation game, asking visitors to decide on transport routes and methods of travel in order to reach a destination in a window of time. On the bottom left is a close-up of the visitor viewing screen of the Design for Life interactive at Weston Park. This screen allows all the visitors in the entire exhibition to watch and converse about what is happening on it, while someone uses the screen on the bottom right to create a creature that they then release into the wild. The point of all of these digital interactives is that they spark conversation amongst groups, specifically intergenerational groups. I'm at about the halfway point of writing, so I handed in 6 months' time, and therefore I haven't formulated every single one of my conclusions yet. But I've come to the end of my data analysis phase, so several key thoughts have begun to emerge, and I'd like to share them with you. Museums are going through change right now in so many ways, and technology is only one part of that. 15 years ago, staff at the museums that I spoke with said that digital was at the time expected. It was new, it was interesting. And now, in this post-digital world, digital is even more expected and even more new and interesting. I've been tossing around for the last few months this idea of why people buy technology in the first place. And as far as I can ascertain as an avid tech user myself, it's for one or more of three reasons. One, because it's available. Two, because it's new or different than what's come before. And three, because other people have it. From what I've seen in museums, these three reasons have governed a lot of digital interactives over the years. But there's one more reason too. Staff believe that the visitors like digital in whatever format it comes. But things have changed. 10 years of staff working with many examples of, at the time, the best technology available has led to lessons learned. Staff who have been around for several years or more, who have watched breakdowns, who have observed interactives that are entirely ignored and others that visitors seem to love, have taken these observations to heart. Bespoke designs are more common than ever. Museum staff are taking on more designs themselves rather than going to external companies, at least where staff resources allow. More museums are hiring tech-minded or educated people. Mobile and personalization are the key words of the day in many institutions. But some things have not changed. Staff still use the public digital literacy discourse when they speak about children and their technology use. Digital in the galleries is still seen as something mainly for visiting families and not so much for educational programs. Staff still believe that children are entertained and more engaged with digital than they are with reading text panels. And museums are still building digital interactives for their galleries or computer programs for tablets that only work in the gallery spaces. Not everything has gone personalized and mobile. And really, no matter how wonderful and innovative the new digital interactives are in the Looking Up Gallery at the National Space Center, they're not that dissimilar from the ones put in when the center opened in 2001, either in their purpose or their use. But where do we go next? As Postdigital begins to flow through everything we do in the museum sector, where does the design of digital interactives go next year or next decade? Technology is changing daily, and it's impossible for museums to keep up with the latest fad, as I think James Davis talked about in depth yesterday. So museums, I think, are turning to their own ideas instead, and their own designs, and that's, I think, as it should be. And also remembering that digital interactives are not why people go to museums. Their objects and collections are. This is my last slide. But perhaps things are already changing. Every now and then I find a gallery like this one, the Alice in Wonderland play space at the Herbert Art Gallery Museum in Coventry. An entire gallery without a single digital interactive. The only limits to it are a child's imagination, and that, as we know, is limitless. Thank you.
So, hi, my name is Elena, and I'm also a distance learner, part-time PhD student at the University of Leicester. And the title of this presentation, that we are seeing the slide, is my main research question. So how can museums measure their impact and value on the social web? So here in this presentation, what I'm going to show you is some of the work I've been doing recently. I'm in the middle of my fieldwork. But before showing you some charts, I'm going to give you a bit of context of how this PhD was born. So this is the start of my PhD. This is the number of people who actually come to the Tate website, came last year. So website visitors is the metric that many museums and many other cultural institutions report to government, to funders, in the case of Tate, to the DCMS. But, well, these numbers, same as if we count people who come to the galleries, do not actually capture the value and the impact that museums have for many reasons. First of all, I mean, it doesn't include all the digital activities we nowadays do in museums. It's only the website, and then we have social media, mobile apps, interactives in the gallery. Then it doesn't tell you much about the actual experience that the visitor is having on the website. And looking at analytics on my day-to-day basis, there are other factors that we don't control that may have an impact actually on this number, like something that went viral on social media, or I don't know, a Google Doodle that suddenly brought lots of visits to the site. So a few years ago, 4 years ago, there was a group of cultural institutions that started looking at how we can evaluate online success. So an action research project was carried out, led by Culture24, and thanks to a collaboration between the University of Leicester and Culture24, I was able to be part of that project. And the main goal during that project was to understand how museums were using social media. So I interviewed some of the partners in this project. I also did some benchmarking of the social media metrics. And one of the main conclusions is that, I mean, there were different levels in the maturity in the definition of social media objectives. And actually there were huge differences, and it was on the objectives depending on where social media sits in the organization. So you have from learning or public programs or marketing. So actually a broad range of objectives using social media. So that's the output of my conclusions was to define a social media framework that at the top you have the main strategic themes that arise while I was in interviewing these people in the group. So some people were using it to create communities, some people were using it more like for creating brand awareness, pure marketing and communication to promote exhibitions and events. Some people were using more as an interactive tool, or distributing content, or even to reply to visitors that were coming to the gallery. And now instead of emailing us, they are there and they're asking, oh, what is this artwork? So there are museums responding directly to visitors using this medium. So after that project, then I focused on one institution, Tate, where I also work. And what I'm trying to do, based on my background, which is business studies, is to define a performance measurement framework that can help Tate to measure the impact and value of their activities on social media. So I based the evaluation framework on the balanced scorecard, which is a model developed by Kaplan and Norton from Harvard. And basically, it looks at the social media activity from different perspectives, from the internal perspective, from the external perspective. And also, it uses a mixed method approach in order to define those methods to evaluate. So what I did at Tate was to first map what Tate was doing on social media, which is huge and one of the challenges of my PhD. So basically, Tate is in almost all the channels on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. And then I also reviewed some strategic documents, and I interviewed different people who work on social media, from the directors to people who manage the activity on the day-to-day basis. So at Tate, this is from the digital strategy that the head of digital, John Stack, wrote and published last year, and which is called Digital as a Dimension of Everything, and this applies as well to social media. It says that, well, social media has transformed Tate's approach to marketing and communication, but actually there are other areas where we can use social media for, and that includes learning, research, curatorial, fundraising. So basically, even within one institution, there are very different objectives depending on who is using social media and what for, and which audiences they are focusing on. So now I'm going to show you some case studies I've done for my research, but just first to reflect on some of the challenges when working on social media metrics. One was mentioned in the panel before: data collection. Having the right tools is very hard. Each social media platform has or not analytics within it. You either need technical skills of a lot of money to pay one of these expensive social media tools. There are some limitations on the way you can collect the data, the format of the content, and then also, of course, things to bear in mind about ethics and privacy. Then, this is one of my day-to-day challenge, is, well, when you do the analysis, and you can use different methods, and also you can use more traditional methods, and I will show some examples in a second, or you can use some new methods, like all these like big data and computational methods. So then once you have done the analysis, how you present it, how you report those figures and visualize it in a way that makes sense for decision making. Because you can report from a very strategic point of view some of the key metrics, key figures, like here's an example of Facebook, so you can report fans, reach, and interaction. But you can also go very granular, and this is all the Tate posts for last year, and the ones in darker blue are the ones that got higher interaction rate. So you can actually go very granular and trying to see what works, what doesn't. But also, so even if that circle is bigger for some post may not be the main objective for some departments. So maybe for marketing, like having loads of likes, loads of shares is good because that fits their purpose, but maybe for others department, they are more interested in the quality of the engagement or in the interaction. And here's an example where we can see these polarized ways of using social media. So the Tanks is a space that opened in 2012 at Tate Modern. Now it's closed because they are building a building on top. And the Tanks is where the oil that fueled the bank power station, the building of was Tate Modern ages ago. And now it's being restored, and now the future of this space is to show live art. So when it opened 2 years ago, the marketing department carried some activity on social media. So there were videos about their activities. They were promoting all the program through different channels. So here, what we wanted to get is reach and awareness of these new spaces. So what we wanted to measure is the volume of tweets, the reach, and trying to identify influencers that were talking about us, and also the word of mouth that was being created. So that's from the marketing perspective. But also, Twitter was not only used for marketing purposes. The interpretation team actually installed a Twitter wall at the exit of the Tanks, and using the hashtag, the Tanks, you were able to send a comment, and your comment will appear automatically projected on the wall, on the Tanks. And there were some prompt questions like those you have in screen. And here, what we wanted to analyze was more like the depth of the engagement. So not only how many people responded to these prompt questions, left a comment about how they felt about the space, but yeah, more that what they were talking about. So we did some content and sentiment analysis in order to understand their experience and that engagement. And here's another case study I wanted to show you. It's probably one of the funniest projects I've worked on evaluating. It was done by my colleague Jane Olson in the digital team, and it's called the 1840s Gift Party Project. And it was focused for a specific audience, people between 15 and 25 years old. And she selected 5 artworks from the 1840s gallery at Tate Britain, and she commissioned a series of artists to produce these animated GIFs. So after that, there was an open call, so anyone was able to participate in this and create their own GIFs. Here are some examples. You can see more if you go to the Tate Collective's Tumblr, where all the GIFs are being uploaded. And here, for the evaluation, we used different methods. So, of course, we counted number of submissions, which really surpassed our expectations. We got over 600 GIFs. The quality of them are absolutely amazing. And we also sent them a survey to see how was their experience. And there was also this one activity that was linked to the gallery. So at Tate, we have this Late at Tate on Fridays. So what was done is those GIFs, all of them were displayed in the gallery in these TV screens alongside the original artworks. So we also did some observations in the gallery, and then we used analytics. So we use, for example, analytics to see the traffic to the collection, to those selected artworks. So you can see that some of them really don't get many visits normally, but thanks to this activity during the open call where everyone was able to participate, you can see a huge increase in number of views of these artworks. Some of these artworks actually traveled really, really far on Tumblr. The one on the left-hand side got over 80,000 reblogs and likes. So But what we wanted to see with this project, I mean, this number, we can put it in the report, but actually we wanted to go a bit further and really understand how these artworks were traveling on Tumblr. So what we did was to use social network analysis in order to represent their journey of these artworks. So you can see the Tate Collective's Tumblr there in yellow, and the network it has around it, and how it traveled to other places. This is an example of one of the submitted GIFs, and this is another one that was from one of the commissioned artists, which is a Scorpion Dagger. So you can see our network and how it has traveled to others, but you can see also the impact this user had in distributing this content across the web. So, back to the question. How can museums measure their impact and value on the social web? I've been on my PhD for years, and it's hard. There is no one simple answer to that. We've seen in these 3 examples that depending on the objectives, you can use different methods. So you can use from analytics and social media analytics tools to content analysis and sentiment analysis to more to other new methods like social network analysis. And now thinking about the post-digital and the fact that digital and social media, as the strategy says, is a dimension of everything and is embedded across the institution. It's not an activity that comes only from the digital team. When we evaluate social media, should we report social media as a whole, or is more a way of reporting within each of the activities and seeing the impact it has to fit those purposes instead of looking at social media in an isolated way? So that's it. Thank you.